Hi, I'm Professor Mike Riddell from Toronto, Canada. I'm here on behalf of the JDRF PEAK working group to give you a presentation on the fundamentals of exercising with type 1 diabetes. Now, exercise has all sorts of benefits for those of us living with type 1 diabetes. I know for me, it helps with my weight maintenance. It increases my muscle mass and strength. It gives me stronger bones and reduced fat mass. And it also helps to lower my blood pressure and give me a better blood lipid profile. Sometimes I even think it helps my blood sugar. In fact, there's some evidence we've published that you may have more glucose time in range if you're more physically active. And that's probably because exercise enhances our insulin sensitivity. Even if you have complications from diabetes, we know that regular activity can help reduce the risk of developing worse complications like retinopathy or nephropathy or kidney disease. For people who don't have complications, it's likely that they'll delay complications if they're more physically active. We can't forget about the psychological benefits of being physically active. It improves my sense of well-being, and I think it helps my self-esteem. My son has type 1, and I certainly encourage him to be active. He plays hockey and does all sorts of sports, including pickleball recently. And I think it's good for him to be able to get out there with his non-diabetic friends and with his friends who are also living with type 1. Sure, there are lots of potential barriers with why some people with type 1 aren't as active as they should be. I think that the fear of hypoglycemia is one of the known barriers for why people on insulin don't want to exercise all that much. There are other barriers. We might feel that uh, having an insulin pump or stopping to check our blood sugar, it might cause some attention. Maybe we're just living a busy schedule. But I think all these potential barriers can be overcome and should be overcome so that we achieve at least 150 minutes per week of accumulated exercise. And I know some of you watching this video are getting that and more. You're training for half marathons, running in the JDRF fundraisers, or maybe you're doing the 100-mile JDRF ride for fundraising purposes. And I think it's to all these people that I'm trying to speak to today to make sure that you're managing your glucose as best you can, given the evidence we have to share with you. Now, why is it that low blood sugar tends to occur with exercise? It's not always a low blood sugar, but more commonly than not, if we're doing aerobic exercise, we see a drop in our blood sugars and we can get hypoglycemia. We know that exercise and the contraction of muscles really takes up glucose out of the bloodstream. High rates of glucose utilization during running and cycling. And the blood sugar really isn't a very large reservoir of glucose. There's only 5 grams of glucose in the bloodstream. And so if you're exercising vigorously, you can burn those 5 grams pretty quickly and blood sugar drops. It's really up to the liver to keep glucose up during exercise. And the liver does that if insulin concentrations drop in circulation during exercise. And people who don't have diabetes, insulin drops right away as soon as they start to exercise. And that's really tough for us to do. If we're living with type 1, we have to turn down the basal infusion rate on our pump, or we have to put the pump in a temp target mode well before exercise. We have to cut our bolus insulin, perhaps. All sorts of ways we try to get insulin down for exercise, but it's really hard to do unless we have a couple strategies in place and think in advance of doing exercise. Now, we do need some insulin for exercise. We know the body requires some insulin in circulation or will produce excessive amounts of ketones during exercise. And we won't be able to exercise very long or very safely. So we need some insulin. It's just a little bit less than on days in which you're sedentary. That's for sure. We need a little less insulin if we're on an active day. Now, in type 1 diabetes, there's another concern that we might have low blood sugars because our glucagon doesn't go up with exercise. And people with long-standing diabetes, glucagon, a hormone that boosts blood sugar, it just doesn't rise with exercise or when we have hypoglycemia. So that could be another reason why low blood sugar is so common around exercise and sport in type 1. I thought maybe we'd share a case that reminds me of those of you who are getting ready for either training for a half marathon or maybe doing a century ride on a bike. Andrew is a 45-year-old who's had type 1 for about 30 years. His A1C is pretty good at somewhere between 7 and 7.5%. He doesn't have complications from his diabetes, and he uses an automated insulin delivery pump or or a smart pump or an AID, whatever you want to call it, that uses a continuous glucose monitor and then automatically changes the basal insulin delivery based on his body's needs. He wants to increase the intensity and frequency of his training so that he can ride the 100-mile Death Valley JDRF ride. He's got the tandem pump with the control IQ, and he can set that into what's called exercise mode, a temporary target that should help reduce his risk for developing hypoglycemia, because that will reduce the insulin delivery during his training sessions and his ride. But he actually gets high blood sugar prior to exercise. And many of us, when we're in a competition setting, or if we're getting ready to go and do some training or a long bike ride, our blood sugars can creep up before the event, and that can be frustrating. Andrew, for breakfast, just had a banana and an energy bar and had a cup of coffee 3 hours before. This is typically what he does in the morning, but on this occasion, because he took 50% less bolus insulin, which is one strategy to lower the insulin delivery for exercise, his blood sugar started to go up. And so he also put his tandem pump in exercise mode around 25 minutes before the start of exercise. So his insulin's down a little bit relative to his carbohydrate consumption, perhaps. And his blood sugar rose to about 250. It's still actually safe for him to exercise, even if his blood sugar is 250, but he feels a bit sluggish when his blood sugar is high. And he noticed that his pump is already giving him some auto corrections, because in this case, that pump will deliver a small amount of bolus insulin, or it'll increase the basal insulin infusion rate to offset this rising glucose. So when he starts the exercise, it's a bit high, but as soon as he begins cycling, he starts to drop. So this is a pretty common scenario for many athletes with type 1, a pre-race rise in glucose. How can we try to prevent that next time? It's okay. He can still go ahead and do the ride. He just has to get that blood sugar back down as he's cycling, and it probably will drop naturally anyway. His second problem might be that he could develop hypoglycemia in his training ride, because, what was the right amount of insulin prior to exercise, and maybe even too little insulin prior to exercise, it can be too much insulin during the exercise if it lasts long enough. So we'll come back to that. So what kind of things, are you thinking right now, if that was you, to try to limit that pre-race rise in glucose? Like what would you do for this? What kind of things might have happened to cause his blood sugar to rise? Maybe it was stress. Maybe it was the type of carbohydrates he ate. Maybe it was the caffeine in the coffee. I just would wonder what you're thinking could be the cause of it, because you're also living with years of experience with this disease, just like I am. Did he treat his insulin pump properly? And if he developed hypoglycemia during the ride, could he have prevented that low? Maybe initiate carbohydrate feeding a bit sooner. So we'll talk about a few of these strategies, and I'll give you what I think maybe could be done if I was in Andrew's shoes. So as far as pre-ride strategies, let's think about what he did. He took 50% of his bolus insulin and he ate carbohydrates. So his blood sugar went up. And maybe he could take a little bit more of his bolus insulin. Instead of a 50% dose, he could have tried a 75% dose. That's one thing he could have tried. He could have cut back a bit on the amount of carbohydrate he had pre-race. You don't really need to have all that much carbohydrates prior to a race if you're going to have carbohydrates during the race or in that training session. So he could have cut back on the carbohydrate at breakfast a little bit. I still would recommend some carbohydrate for sure, but maybe instead of 60 grams, consuming maybe 40 grams or 30 grams. He could have also placed his hybrid closed loop pump on exercise mode about an hour before exercise started, because that might help to prevent the low blood sugar that eventually came during his training ride session. Now, I've been living with diabetes for, 40 years, and I still make these kind of mistakes. So don't feel bad if you make them too and you see them. We're always learning about our own unique responses and how to manage them. I have some general tips for those of you who are training for these big century rides. The longest ride I've ever done so far is about 60 miles. If I was training for a 100-mile ride, I generally try to work up from a 20-mile ride, that first ride, up to 50 miles, then maybe 90 miles over a span of a couple months. We can't expect to be there in 1 or 2 weeks. We have to train a lot for these types of events and really work on the fine tuning of my carbohydrate feeding strategies. Think about what breakfast to have that seems to keep my sugars kind of in control, but also keeps my stomach happy. And I find that for me, oatmeal is a good breakfast with some whole milk in it with a bit of fat and some protein, peanut butter, things like that. So you need to figure out what seems to be consistently working for you. Ideally, you should try to start your ride with a blood sugar kind of somewhere between 90 and 180 milligrams per deciliter. I think during exercise, the ideal range is 120 to 140, we found for most individuals. Trying to keep it there can be tricky, but if you're using CGM, you can keep an eye on it even when you're cycling or running. If you're on a basal insulin delivery pump, a standard pump, you can certainly keep the basal rate high or normal and feed at 60 grams of carbohydrate per hour, then you wouldn't have to bolus insulin. If you're on an AID or a closed loop pump, again, you can feed maybe up to 60 grams an hour, and the basal rate will probably cover that carbohydrate. You won't need to bolus for that. So that's a very good strategy that a lot of pro cyclists with type 1 use. And don't forget about hydration. You should be consuming about 2 liters of fluid per hour. And sometimes that might be in the form of water if the blood sugar's if the blood sugar's a bit elevated, or it could be a sport beverage if the blood sugar's dropping. I'll come back to that later. If you're training for a marathon or half marathon, it's kind of the same recommendations. Start slow, gradually work up to 30, 40-minute runs at a slow pace. Get up to around 2-hour runs. Again, learning about your own unique diabetes self-management strategies over 6 to 8 weeks. And there's a great blog on the Garmin Marathon website. It's a great training blog on how to do this. And I follow this Garmin training blog myself for training for half marathons. Some runs are easy and slow, and some runs are very fast and short, and that'll get your training up to speed. Training before breakfast for many individuals is very beneficial if it's not a really long endurance training session. So I go for runs for 30, 45 minutes before breakfast. My insulin on board is very low then. I have a bit of caffeine in my body. I don't get hypoglycemia, and I don't need to carbohydrate fuel that much. In the morning, you burn more fat as an energy source, and you tend not to be as insulin sensitive in the morning. So training in the morning seems to be beneficial. Again, if you train at other parts of the day, keep an eye on the insulin on board, because training with high insulin on board, high bolus insulin on board, really causes glucose to drop. So most pumps will show how much insulin you have in circulation, how much active insulin you have in circulation. If you're on MDI, you kind of have to do the math and figure out when your insulin is peaking in action and starting to disappear. If insulin on board is high, you're going to require carbohydrate feeding. So on MDI, you can lower your basal insulin delivery during this training period. You can get your insulin down by 20% easily if you become more trained and more physically fit. You don't need as much insulin. Your insulin pump, you can do the same. You can drop your basal rates by 20% overall during a training period. And I mean, like, changing your infusion rate, let's say from 1 unit of insulin per hour down to maybe 0.8 units per hour once you hit that trained state in a few weeks. And your healthcare provider can give you better guidance maybe on that too, on how much to change your insulin to carb ratio and your basal rates once you've become more trained. Once you're training your body, you also have to train your gut, because your gut needs to get used to consuming carbohydrates during exercise. And I think you need at least 80 grams per hour if you're doing half marathons and marathons. Ideally 60 grams per hour if your stomach can handle that. And your target glucose should be around 120 to 140 for performance reasons. And to help prevent hypo and hyperglycemia. Now, not all exercise is endurance exercise. Some of you out there are actually training for power sports. Maybe you're doing high intensity interval training, or maybe you play a team sport that's more burst in nature, like basketball or soccer. And these different forms of exercise can have completely different effects on glucose. And really trying to mimic the physiology of these different sports is tricky. I think this cartoon maybe shows you some of the key points here. If you're doing aerobic activity, like cycling and running, the workout is pretty constant in intensity. It's moderate, and it could be for several minutes to hours. You're going to see glucose drop. And some of the factors that can predict the amount of drop are shown on the bottom here. The longer you exercise, the more intense it is, the more fit you are. And if your insulin on board is high, it's going to drop more. And there are other variables that we're starting to learn about. In other sports that are more mixed, where there's bursts of high intensity effort, you can see here in purple, the burst of activity goes up, and then in blue, it's coming down a bit. We have a moderating effect. Glucose stays pretty flat, but again, depends on some of these variables shown here. And if you do very intense exercise, like if you're a sprint swimmer, a sprint runner, or if you're a power lifter, you're going to see a rise in glucose. In particular, if you do these activities in the morning and your insulin on board is low. So different physiology and different strategies required. So we don't have normal physiology when we exercise. We don't automatically change our insulin secretion from our pancreas because we don't have functioning beta cells. So mimicking this in type 1 diabetes is really quite tricky. This cartoon, I think, shows you some of the strategies we try to think about to preserve blood sugar levels during exercise, in particular prolonged exercise. We want to get insulin down in circulation, and we do that so that the liver can dump more glucose at the same rate that the muscles are taking it up. This is the normal physiology on the top, panel A, we're trying to mimic. And we can trick our counter-regulatory hormones, like we can boost our adrenaline and noradrenaline and our cortisol. If we do some intense warm-ups, we can get those hormones up. And we can lower our insulin delivery on a pump or reduce our insulin delivery by needles. We can try to mimic this, but this, again, is tricky to do perfectly. In some cases, we'll get hypoglycemia because the insulin's just too high in circulation. And when insulin's high, the liver can't dump glucose into circulation. We have to drink carbohydrates or eat them. And we may have deficiency in our glucagon response to exercise I mentioned earlier. But in some cases, blood sugar goes up, and it might be that in those cases, we didn't take quite enough insulin. Our insulin on board is a bit too low, particularly for intense exercise. Or we're having an exaggerated stress response. Because of competition stress, our adrenaline is already high, our cortisol is high, and we haven't even started to race yet. Our blood sugar can go up. So there's lots of different reasons that and other reasons that can explain why blood sugars are going up and down with different sports and exercises that we do. Now, we know from some published research that there is quite a bit of variability. If you do aerobic exercise, like a jog or a bike ride at a moderate intensity for about 75 minutes, and you take 100 people with diabetes, type 1, and if they all do pretty much the same thing, they exercise with the same amount of insulin on board and they don't consume carbohydrates, you still get a variable drop in blood sugar levels. In blue shows the average drop, which could be 50 milligrams per deciliter, but some individuals will drop 100 milligrams. And others, even though they do much the same thing, only drop a little bit, maybe 20 milligrams. So that's if they don't adjust their insulin. So this variability is puzzling. We have to learn our own unique responses. And we're still learning about what it is about our own unique physiology that causes us to drop more than others or less than others. The thing is, resistance exercise can certainly cause you to drop less. So in this one study done by Jane Yardley, she showed that if individuals living with type 1 do aerobic exercise, they get a drop. But if these same individuals do resistance exercise, just another type of workout, the glucose stays really flat. It doesn't drop. So she went on to theorize that maybe you should do resistance exercise first before you do your aerobic exercise, and you'll prevent that drop altogether, which she did show in a follow-up paper to some degree. So I like to work out both with resistance first and then do some aerobic exercise. And I think I get better blood sugar control because of that. Oh, on the other hand, though, if your blood sugar is high above your target, your goal, you might want to start with aerobic exercise. Let's say you're 250 milligrams per deciliter. That's when you would do your aerobic first and save the intense exercise for later. Now, exercise can cause a low during an activity, but it also can cause a high blood sugar during activity. And I think that exercise in the form of a sprint, the muscles are using stored glycogen as the most predominant fuel source, not blood sugar. So that's why you might see a rise in blood sugar. The muscles just aren't chewing up blood sugar at a very high rate during a sprint. It's using energy from within the muscle glycogen and muscle ATP. So that's maybe why blood sugar goes up, but there are other reasons perhaps. Sometimes hyperglycemia and hypoglycemia are caused by other reasons, and they're listed here. If you've had a recent low blood sugar event in the last 24 hours, it increases your risk for a low blood sugar event during exercise and even the following night. Having high IOB increases hypoglycemia risk. Doing really prolonged, moderate activity, even light activity for a long time, like a game of golf, might cause a low blood sugar. And doing exercise in the afternoon tends to cause more risk for hypoglycemia. There's also other reasons why we get high blood sugar with exercise and sport. We might have forgotten to deliver any insulin, or we could have a blocked infusion set. As I mentioned before, the exercise could be competitive. The IOB could be too low. We've overconsumed carbohydrates. We're dehydrated. There are all sorts of reasons why we might be getting hyperglycemia. And sometimes it's really hard for me to know what reason is causing my exercise high blood sugar. And I think about all these things and try to repair them. But sometimes you just don't know. You just have to treat conservatively with a little bit of insulin after exercise. Now, we know from some other published studies out of Australia that your hypo risk during aerobic exercise is immediately during the exercise and a little bit after exercise in early recovery. So if you do exercise, let's say at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, you've got hypo risk during the exercise, maybe it lasts 40 minutes, and then you've got a little bit of hypo risk after the exercise is done because you're still pretty insulin sensitive. So maybe just before dinner. Then the hypo risk kind of disappears for a window of time in many people and then reappears 7 to 11 hours later after the exercise has been done. And this is like a second hit of hypoglycemia. And we don't fully know the reason for that, but we think it has to do with replenishing some of the glycogen that was used during the aerobic exercise. You are much more insulin sensitive. These are glucose infusion experiments, carefully conducted studies in a clinic setting where they infuse glucose to figure out when the hypo risk occurs. But we see the same thing when we look at CGM tracings from athletes with type 1. Hypo during, and then 7 to 11 hours after, sometimes when they're sleeping. And again, here's a CGM tracing from one of our cyclists who had a bit of a hypo during the cycling and then had a rebound rise in blood sugar after the exercise was done, probably because of the food he was eating, and then a second hypo that lasted a long time overnight. You can see the glucose drop at around 3 a.m. and stay hypoglycemic for several hours. Now, he didn't have a glucose monitor that had alerts or alarms. This was a blinded CGM, and most of us now are using CGMs where we can have alerts and alarms that'll warn us if our blood sugar is too low, which I think is a real advantage of the newer technologies. Now, if you're training and you're becoming more insulin sensitive, we really need to cut back on your total daily insulin dose. And I think this cartoon shows that nicely. If you take someone who's not trained and is somewhat overweight, they need a lot more insulin throughout the day, both basal and bolus insulin compared to when they're in the train state and they've lost some body fat. In blue, it shows the total insulin requirements, both basal and bolus, have to come down. So as you go through this training period in your lives, don't keep treating with extra carbohydrates when you really should be cutting back on your total daily insulin delivery dose. And you should do that, of course, in under the guidance of your own healthcare team. I'm not going to tell you what to do here, but it's just in the back of your mind. If you're becoming more trained, tell your healthcare team you think you might need to cut back on your basal rates or your insulin to carb ratios. We know that becoming more fit does a bunch of things that are good for you. It helps you to burn fat better. It increases your muscle glycogen content so you can dispose of carbohydrates after a meal more readily. And it increases your insulin sensitivity, so your total daily insulin dose goes down. But hypoglycemia does not go away with training, which is surprising. We thought maybe in a trained individual, they'd have less hypoglycemia, but they have just as much or even more because they're using glucose so much more effectively when they exercise, when they train, and when they compete. So again, I just want to emphasize, if you've had a recent low blood sugar, it's going to increase your risk for having a low again in the near future. And we've seen, in fact, that people who have a low blood sugar before exercise, they tend to have a greater risk for a low blood sugar in exercise. And it becomes this vicious cycle. We think that these low blood sugars blunt our body's counter-regulation to hypoglycemia. So we don't mount a very good catecholamine response, a glucagon response, a growth hormone response, or a cortisol response if we've had recent lows. So we need to break that cycle, have our blood sugars ride a bit higher, keep an eye on our CGM a lot more frequently, and make sure we prevent lows for the next 72 hours to break that cycle. I'm going to finish with a couple of strategies for cool down and some insulin dose adjustments. I think people underestimate the importance of warm up and cool down. I said that you should really consider a warm up of intense exercise if you want to prevent a low blood sugar. If your blood sugar is already too high, do a aerobic warm up to bring it down. And think about how you can also adjust your cool down after exercise. If you have a high blood sugar at the end of your workout, doing a nice prolonged cool down can help bring the blood sugar back down. And we've learned this from elite cyclists with type 1, but also from several case studies that have been featured in a couple of journal articles. We know that high blood sugar after exercise can really be treated by just doing some mild walking. Sometimes you might need an insulin correction, but it can be a really small dose of insulin, particularly if you do some aerobic cool down. We call this a prolonged passive cool down. So just cycling at a light wattage on a stationary bike, walking, stretching, and keeping the eye on the CGM, because you'll typically see the glucose come back down to target if you do these cool downs after an intense exercise session. Again, warm up. Again, if your glucose is high, the warm up should be aerobic. If the glucose is on target, or low, it should be a very intense exercise warm-up to bring up the catecholamines and bring up the glucose concentrations. And I always try to get a cool down in of around 20 minutes if I've done a really difficult workout. Although finding 20 minutes at the end of a workout can be a challenge if you're pretty busy. You can correct high blood sugar with insulin. If you've remained hyperglycemic post-exercise for a long time, maybe over 220 for a long time, you can give a small conservative dose of insulin, maybe 50% of your usual correction dose, to be on the cautious side, because we know you're going to be insulin sensitive, again, 7 to 11 hours later. So you don't want to take too much insulin on cool down. All right, so just a summary of some facts to consider as you're planning your strategies over the next little while. Think about the type of exercise you do and you want to do. Think about the duration of activity for your training sessions and the timing of your exercise relative to your insulin and food administration, because then you'll get a better idea of your insulin on board and your carbs on board when you're training. And I think that's really critical. If you've had a recent low blood sugar event, you have to be super vigilant to monitor and maybe even avoid exercise if you had a severe hypoglycemic event for about 72 hours. Have a backup plan. Always make sure you've got extra supplies. If you're away from home and you're exercising, I like to bring extra insulin infusion sets, extra CGM supplies if I'm on hikes, spare pumps and needles as backup, even though I'm on a pump. And I now carry the inhaled glucagon because it's quite portable and easy to use. If you have access to that, medical alerts and carbs are also essential. Again, think about insulin on board. I've got a couple of cartoons to share this. If this is a new term to you, insulin on board means how much bolus insulin is still working in the body after administering either a dose of insulin for food or an insulin correction dose that comes in the form of a bolus. If you're going to be exercising within 120 minutes of a bolus of insulin, you're going to need probably carbohydrates. If you can change that insulin dose, you could lower it by somewhere between 25 to 75%. Starting at 50% is a good starting point. Try, if exercise is going to be within 2 hours of a meal, cut that bolus by around half and see how that turns out for you. If you're exercising more than 2 hours after a meal, I don't typically recommend cutting the bolus because your insulin on board is starting to drop off. It might take 4 hours for the insulin on board to reach zero after a large bolus injection, though. And you can kind of see that from this cartoon here. In purple is a small bolus administered to someone. Let's say, for me, a small bolus would be under 2 units of insulin. For you, a small bolus may be a different amount. But if I double that or triple that, if I take, instead of 2 units, 6 units, you can see in blue, the time of insulin lasts longer. I'm going to have insulin on board for a longer period of time if I take a large dose of insulin. So thinking about in the meal before endurance exercise, try to get that insulin dose down a bit. Don't overeat carbohydrates. And try to cut the insulin bolus a little bit so you can get your insulin on board down and then have less hypoglycemia risk when you're doing the aerobic exercise. Again, the strategy is recommending in general cutting the bolus insulin if you're doing exercise within 2 hours of a meal, but don't bother cutting the insulin if it's more than 2 hours after a meal, but you still might need some carbohydrates because you still could have insulin on board in circulation. Basal insulin is another tool you can use to try to adapt for exercise. Basal insulin can be turned down 2 hours before the start of exercise, if you like, and you'll get insulin concentrations quite low in circulation by exercise start time. But this requires a lot of pre-planning. We often forget to turn down our basal rates that far in advance of exercise. I do anyway. So if you're on MDI, you can cut the basal dose by 20%. If you're on a long or ultra long acting insulin, that's perfectly fine to do. If you're on pumps, turn the basal rate down, maybe by 50% or up to 80%, and try to do that an hour before or so. Some people even do it 90 or 100 minutes before they cut down that basal rate. But then you kind of have to avoid carbohydrate feeding in that time window or your blood sugar might rise. If you're on a closed loop system, it's kind of essential to put that temp target on an hour before planned exercise if you really want to see an effect. And then cancel that temp target when the exercise is done. Here are just some strategies on what you can do if you're trying to aim for a certain starting blood sugar and it's not quite there. Like if your goal is 125 to 180 for starting blood sugar, and you're not there, if you're below, you can just ingest small amounts of carb. Showing here 10 to 20 grams of carb if the blood sugar is below 90, maybe 10 grams if it's between 90 and 124. And that could be 5 minutes before you begin exercise, and it'll come up. Maybe 10 minutes before it'll come up in time. If you're between 125 and 180, go ahead and start your exercise. And if your blood sugar's on the real high side, we like to recommend checking for ketones, because if you have ketones in your blood or urine, the blood sugar might go up during exercise. So you should have some insulin if you have ketones that are above 1.5 millimole measured in blood. If you don't have ketones, you can go ahead and do aerobic exercise. I'm sure the glucose will probably drop unless you're under some sort of competition stress. So during exercise, you've got a choice on your water bottles. Maybe you carry 2 water bottles in your bike. You can have water in 1 water bottle, like I do, and I do that mostly water ingestion. If my blood sugar's a bit on the high side, and if the exercise isn't that long, I'll just consume water. But I'll consume a sport beverage if the exercise is longer, or if my blood sugar drops below about 125 milligrams per deciliter. And the carbohydrate beverage usually is somewhere between 6% and 8%. We've published that these types of concentrations, which you can find in things like Gatorade or Allsport, are fine to drink if you have type 1 diabetes, and they can help improve performance and help reduce the risk for dehydration because they have sodium in them. If your blood sugar is a bit higher, you can also try other products that have less carbohydrate in them, like something like G2 has less carbohydrate content than regular Gatorade. So again, just some summary notes from our working group. You don't really need carbohydrates for performance if the activity is 30 minutes or so. You might need carbohydrates if the activity is 30 to 60 minutes, but again, you don't probably need much unless your insulin on board is high. If the activity is greater than 60 minutes, you should really pump up the carbohydrate intake for performance reasons. We know that consuming around 60 grams per hour is associated with better endurance performance, even in people with type 1 diabetes. Some people on a low-carb diet who are doing well, they don't want to do this, and they don't have to do this. If their glucose is fine without being on a high carbohydrate intake, and if they feel well and their blood sugar is not in the hypoglycemic range, we let them do it. We let them do it for sure. And then there's some comments about water being an adequate beverage for most short-term activity, particularly if your glucose is at or above target. Making sure we consume about 2 liters per hour if we're in an environment where we're sweating a lot. Now, after exercise, unfortunately, diabetes is not done. We have to think about carbohydrate consumption to replenish the carbohydrate fuels during exercise. I like to recommend about 1 gram per kilogram body weight. So if I weigh 70 kilos, I have about 70 grams in my big recovery meal. Sometimes I'll consume less, that's fine. Protein is critical for recovery. We need to consume our protein soon after exercise to help repair muscle proteins that have been damaged during exercise. And if you have a protein snack at bedtime, along with carbohydrate feeding, it can prevent hypoglycemia overnight because carbohydrates and protein can work together to keep glucose up and enhance muscle glycogen synthesis. Overnight, if you have problems with hypoglycemia, like some people do, you can reduce your nocturnal or your bedtime basal insulin if you take that by needle, or you'll have to resort to carbohydrate feeding with some protein in it, as I mentioned before. Monitoring is critical after vigorous exercise that was done in the afternoon. If you're on an insulin pump and it's not a closed loop pump, then you can reduce the basal rate, do a temporary basal rate reduction by about 20%, lasting for 6 hours. That seems to help prevent nocturnal hypoglycemia if exercise was done in the late afternoon. Or you can just increase your carbohydrate-free snack, or your carbohydrate snacking with a bit of protein. We call these free snacks because we're not taking insulin for them. And obviously monitoring with CGM is pretty critical overnight, I think. So just to summarize everything we've talked about in the session today, we've got all sorts of different activities that people out there are doing. And I think I applaud all of you for the different sports and achievements that you've done and will continue to do while living with type 1. Certainly exercise can cause a bit of blood sugar dysglycemia, as we call it, sometimes a high blood sugar, sometimes a low. And we have to fine tune our strategies for exercise because it's not simple to mimic the normal physiology of someone who doesn't have diabetes with respect to blood sugar management. We know that insulin sensitivity will be enhanced if you improve your fitness and lower your body fat. So you can take less total daily dose of insulin, cut back on your basal bolus insulin. And we know that recent hypoglycemic events unfortunately make exercise a bit more risky because we are likely to have a hypoglycemic event during exercise. So try to cut back on your insulin. If you've had a recent hypoglycemic event, ride your blood sugar a little bit higher. And if you've had a severe hypo event, really you should postpone exercise for at least 72 hours because it could just be too dangerous. We talked about strategies for warm up and cool down to fine tune our blood sugar control. And I suggested a starting glucose of anywhere between 120 to 180 is fine, perfectly fine for exercise. Some people find 120 to 140 the sweet spot for their performance, but that can be up to your own individual experiences. I really believe in the use of CGM for all of us who are physically active. And I'm a believer that we can consume carbohydrates at the same rate that non-diabetic athletes do, up to 60 grams per hour. We just may have to keep the basal insulin delivery up a bit if we want to consume carbohydrates at that volume, at that rate. And exercise, unfortunately, means we still have some things to think about in recovery. When exercise is done, we have to fuel properly. We have to monitor for post-exercise hypo and hyperglycemia and treat accordingly. And we really have to make sure that we have days off if we're training intensely, because our body does need to recover from such extreme exercise training events. Thanks a lot for the opportunity to speak to you, and please feel free to reach out to the JDRF or to me personally if you've got some challenges and or strategies you want to share with me. Thanks very much.